So back in July of 2025, I released the following video titled Sony is Suing Tencent, in which I covered how Sony believes that Tencent, with their new game Light of Motiram, is in breach because the game that they're making here just uncannily resembles the Horizon series, especially where sort of the general art direction is concerned, where you could look at Light of Motiram and think that it's a Horizon game. And I will say that in this scenario, Sony does make a point, because if you look at concept art for Light of Motiram and then look at concept art for Horizon, I mean, yeah, it's pretty uncanny. And it's not just the concept art. If you look at in-game screenshots, this is a side-by-side between Light of Motiram and Horizon. And at a glance, you'd be hard-pressed to know which is which. You know, if you look at these side-by-side, the similarities are so stark that you could confuse one for the other. I'd say that's a fair argument to make. And the general sentiment in the game community is that, yeah, Light of Motiram is definitely on many levels copying Horizon, to the point where on social media, people are saying things like Horizon Zero originality and Horizon Forbidden creativity. It's not just still shots. Even if you look at things like trailers, you'll find that this could be confused for Horizon. Like the music, just the general vibe evokes a lot of what Horizon did. And not to say that Horizon has this monopoly on a specific genre, but there's a very specific way that Horizon does what it does, and Light of Motiram, like, nearly one-to-one copies, at the very least, those vibes. Now, when it comes to gameplay, Light of Motiram is a very different game. While at a glance, you could, again, confuse this for Horizon, when you get into the nitty-gritty, it is a survival game akin to Ark, with like elements of Power World and some Monster Hunter-style combat and hunting of machines and whatnot. So gameplay-wise, I don't think there's any resemblance to Horizon, but if you just look at the game and look at its art direction, you could argue, yep, that looks a hell lot like Horizon. And Sony thought so much that they went ahead and sued Tencent back in July 28th, 2025, stating things like, this game, Light of Motiram, is a slavish clone of Horizon, saying that the game features identical gameplay, story, themes, and artistic elements to Horizon, as well as many other similarities. While I would say that identical gameplay is too far reach, when it comes to artistic elements and themes and many other similarities, just in terms of aesthetic, I would agree that, yeah, it is very close to Horizon. And so what's happened since? Well, a couple developments from Tencent's own reaction to Sony's response to Tencent's reaction. Now, on August 7th of 2025, something that didn't give Tencent and Light of Motiram a whole lot of credence is the fact that they scrubbed their Steam page to not include elements that more resemble Horizon. So, for example, one of the key arts once upon a time featured a character who's dressed a lot like Aloy, and now the key art is just mechs, you know, these cute mechs right here that try to obfuscate some of the resemblances to Horizon. And if you go to the Steam page right now, you'll find that the key art has in fact been changed, and that some of the more Horizon-esque screenshots and artwork have been removed from the store page. If Tencent really believed that they didn't copy anything, then they wouldn't have pulled something like this. But the fact that they responded and reacted at all in this way does kind of evoke some culpability. But then fast forward to September 18th, 2025, and Tencent decided to fight Sony on all of their claims, as reported here by news outlet The Game Post. Tencent essentially filed a motion to dismiss Sony's lawsuit and case, insisting that the lawsuit is essentially an overreach because they believe that Sony isn't pursuing this lawsuit because they're protecting unique creative work, but rather they're trying to monopolize certain storytelling conventions and certain genres, essentially. Here's a direct quote from Tencent's response to Sony's lawsuit. Sony's effort is not aimed at fighting off piracy, plagiarism, or any genuine threat to intellectual property. It is an improper attempt to fence off a well-trodden corner of popular culture and declare it Sony's exclusive domain. In Sony's telling, Horizon Zero Dawn is like no fictional world created before or since. That claim is startling because it is flatly contradicted by Sony's own developers, not to mention the long history of video games featuring the same elements that Sony seeks to monopolize through this lawsuit, is what Tencent is accusing Sony of. In terms of what Tencent is referring to when they say that Sony contradicted itself, is the fact that if you look at a behind-the-scenes documentary for Horizon Zero Dawn, there's a segment where the art director for Horizon Zero Dawn was afraid that Horizon bared too much of a resemblance to Enslaved Odyssey of the West, which came out back in 2013, which was also this post-apocalyptic world that featured mechs in it. As Tencent put it here in a behind-the-scenes documentary, the art director for Horizon Zero Dawn, Jan Bart van Beek, explained that the game's core conceit, an intrepid, red-haired woman navigating the ruins of a shattered civilization overrun by robotic beasts, had already been executed by a different video game studio in the 2013 title, Enslaved Odyssey to the West. But the thing about this lawsuit is that it's not about Light of Motiram tackling the genre of a post-apocalyptic world with a female protagonist that features mechs. Sony's issue with Light of Motiram is that it aesthetically just looks so similar to Horizon specifically that you could confuse Light of Motiram for Horizon. Whereas with Enslaved Odyssey to the West, if you look at the screenshots here, while there are some of those like genre elements that Horizon tackles, you can't really confuse this game for Horizon. You look at this and you don't see this as a Horizon game. It's clearly its own aesthetic, its own art style, its own kind of art direction that features a similar style of setting, but does it in its own unique way with its own unique identity. Whereas Light of Motiram, Sony argues, is essentially stealing Horizon's identity, or, borrowing so heavily from it that it might as well be copying it. Tencent also argues that Sony's lawsuit is hypocritical, given that Horizon features a lot of tropes from many games released before it, highlighting titles like Enslaved, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Far Cry Primal, Far Cry New Dawn, Outer Wilds, Biomutant, and many more. And yeah, Horizon does borrow a lot of gameplay elements from titles that came before it, but when it comes to all these mentioned games here, you can't confuse them for Horizon because they are still very unique in their overall visual and audio language and their overall art style. Something else that Tencent addresses is Sony mentioning their lawsuit that once upon a time, Sony and Tencent had met at GDC in San Francisco back in March of 2024 to discuss a potential collaboration where Sony would license the Horizon series to Tencent for them to make a game out of it. But those talks fell through, and Sony ultimately didn't approve of Tencent making their own Horizon game. The argument being that Tencent essentially decided to take what that potential collaboration could have been and instead made legally distinct Horizon, but kept so many of the resemblances and similarities to Horizon that Sony felt that they had to pursue legal action. Tencent's counter argument to that is that technically Tencent wasn't present because only its subsidiaries were participating in those meetings, and they try to separate Tencent away from the developers of Light of Motiram. The entities that were sued are Tencent America, Proxima Beta US, and Tencent Holdings, and Tencent claims that these are not actually the parties who are developing or publishing Light of Motiram. Here's a direct quote from Tencent in the response. None of the served defendants develop and market the Light of Motiram video game that Sony alleges infringes its intellectual property in the Horizon series, highlighting how Light of Motiram is both published and developed by companies Polaris Quest and Proxima Beta. If you go to Steam right now, you can see that the developer and publisher are listed as Polaris Quest and not Tencent. And so Tencent's claim is that technically Tencent wasn't involved in these meetings and that Tencent itself isn't directly making Light of Motiram and aren't the entities who are directly tied to this game. They're saying that Sony suing Tencent is technically incorrect because in terms of the corporate structure of entities, Tencent technically wasn't involved, with Tencent citing that Tencent Holdings is just the parent company, a holding entity incorporated in the Cayman Islands and headquartered in Shenzhen, China, doesn't actually make games. And they add right here that the parent company Tencent doesn't actually make games, run marketing, or control the day-to-day operations of the studios. Now, I'm no lawyer and I don't know how the letter of the law categorizes all of this, but Polaris Quest, being a subsidiary of Tencent, does technically mean that Tencent is involved. But in terms of them setting up essentially like shell corporations or subsidiaries that kind of allow legal separation, maybe there's a loophole that allows Tencent to get away with this. But just from a common sense standpoint, if Polaris Quest, the developers of Light of Motiram, are under the directive of parent company Tencent, because it is a subsidiary of Tencent, then Tencent is liable and responsible for Polaris Quest's actions. And that's something that Sony itself will argue in their counterargument, which I'll get to in a bit. But before that, one last argument that Tencent makes is that Light of Motiram doesn't come out until the end of 2027. Tencent says the lawsuit is built on hypotheticals. Their argument is because the game isn't technically out, it hasn't really infringed anything because it's not a product that exists yet. Though I'm not sure that's how that technically works. I have seen many game publishers and companies sue entities before their product comes out because they deem it to be copyright infringement. So for example, like Nintendo has sued a lot of like fan projects even before they came out, and they shut it down before it came out. All right, so that finally brings us to October 16th, 2025, when News Outlet The Game Post published this article that reports on Sony firing back against Tencent's response to Sony's lawsuit, with Sony straight up saying, like, this is all nonsense, what they're arguing here, and just going scorched earth on Tencent and clearly not letting up on this. One of the first counterarguments that Sony makes is that Light of Motiram making its release window Q4 of 2027, arguing that the game is still far out, that it's all hypothetical because the game is not finished and it's still in development and a lot of things can change, that is not a sound argument against a copyright lawsuit because of the degree to which they've marketed Light of Motiram, enough that it's garnered a lot of views and a lot of eyes are on it, and Sony believes that people who look at that game that's being heavily marketed can confuse Light of Motiram for Horizon. And Sony also took notice of the fact that Tencent did swap out images and screenshots and key art on listings like this one on Steam. They say that this doesn't change the fact that the game itself, that is still being marketed through footage and whatnot, the elements included in it still have a lot of things that resemble Horizon. Them changing all of this doesn't suddenly undo the Horizon similarities in the game itself. Or here's how Sony put it in their recent court filing: "This is nonsense. The damage is done and it continues." Although the public expressed confusion and outrage upon discovering Light of Motiram for the knockoff that it is, Tencent remained undeterred. Tencent continued promoting its infringing game over SIE's objection, and Tencent refused to accept any responsibility over its conduct. And then Sony fires back against the argument that technically Tencent, the parent company, isn't affiliated with Light of Motiram because that game is ultimately being developed by a subsidiary called Polaris Quest, that's shown here on Steam. And Tencent tries to essentially separate themselves as a corporate entity from Polaris Quest. Sony argues that this is just Tencent trying to engage in loopholes and trying to play corporate hide and seek to dodge accountability, accusing Tencent of running a shell game with its brands and entities. They're trying to get away with it on technicalities and legal loopholes rather than the actual facts of the matter, which is that Tencent Holdings is the parent company and everything under their umbrella they're responsible for. They're the ones greenlighting that stuff. So Sony makes it a point to highlight that Tencent Holdings, the parent company, is, quote, at the helm, noting that they are the holders of the trademark for Light of Motiram, noting that they're the official owners of the domain lightofmotiram.com and operates the broader Tencent Games brand. Sony argues that all of those connections point to the parent company's direct involvement and US targeting. Tencent's attempted separation from Light of Motiram just seems like a really weak argument. Again, legally speaking, I don't know if this is something that Tencent can get away with, but just because you can legally get away with something because the law hasn't been airtight enough doesn't mean that what you're doing is correct. Being able to legally get away with something doesn't make that thing you get away with morally correct. But Sony's arguments that do point to various elements that Tencent Holdings is directly linked to when it comes to Light of Motiram, that does make for a strong argument, I'd say. And then Sony delves even deeper with this quote: Tencent Holdings describes its own business as having a games division that owns Aurora Studios, the Light of Motiram development studio. Tencent Holdings reports all of its revenue and debt from games on its annual report without attribution to any subsidiary, and it uses the name Tencent to advertise its games like Light of Motiram without distinguishing between subsidiaries. Now, Sony gets more specific here, highlighting that what Light of Motiram borrows from Horizon is the game's look, sound, characters, and narrative, and even many aspects of the music, right down to the music and tribal tech aesthetic, Sony say here, highlighting how Tencent even hired a composer who worked on Horizon Forbidden West to recreate the same musical tone. If that is true, if they hired a composer who worked on Horizon Forbidden West, that part is rather damning. Not to say you're not allowed to hire a composer who specializes in a specific genre, but when you pair that with everything else about this game that resembles Horizon, it's just not a good look. And yeah, this time they don't say that the gameplay is identical, because that is detrimental to Sony's argument. But when it comes to like look, sound, characters, and narrative, you could argue that a lot of those elements do look very familiar and similar. But yeah, Sony goes on to essentially directly quote some of the feedback they've seen online, particularly journalists and Horizon fans who've said that Light of Motiram is, quote, a major Horizon ripoff, an obvious knockoff, a copycat, resembles Aloy to a T, the character they've shown for Light of Motiram, so on and so forth. Sony also fights against Tencent's claims that the US courts do not have jurisdiction because Light of Motiram is being developed in China. It hasn't launched in the US, but Sony points out that the game has been marketed for the US, that promotion materials were distributed in the US, that the domain of Light of Motiram is registered in the US. And then the meeting that they had for a potential collaboration where Tencent showed off essentially like, I guess, a vertical slice of what their version of Horizon would look like, a project by the name Project Z. All of that happened during GDC, which takes place in the US, specifically in San Francisco. So given how much Light of Motiram has been involved with the US market, especially where marketing is concerned, and even like behind the scenes discussions, Sony's argument is that the US courts do in fact have jurisdiction. And when things like the domain name are registered in the US, I mean, there is enough of a direct link where that argument could be made, though again, the letter of the law is another thing entirely, and I'm no lawyer to be able to exactly say for sure how that works. And then last but not least, Sony argued that there might even be trademark infringement involved because Aloy has become essentially an iconic part of Sony and PlayStation's brand. A brand symbol is how PlayStation put it. It's like a mascot almost, one of Sony's mascots. And so Tencent using a character who resembles Aloy enough where the confusion could happen, all of the different characteristics that make Aloy being employed so heavily for Light of Motiram's female character, Sony insists that that could be trademark infringement as well, citing that Aloy is not just some generic character in the same way that Mario, has very specific design elements that make Mario Mario, and Mario being, such a big mascot and symbol of Nintendo, a brand symbol for that company. It's kind of like that similar argument of like if somebody took a design that's very similar to Mario's and made a game out of it, that could potentially be deemed, trademark infringement for the fact that a brand symbol is being taken and not just something that's a little more generic. I don't know how that will hold up in court, but when it comes to the overall aesthetic and art direction and visual language and audio language, those similarities, I would argue that Sony has a pretty strong case, at least just from a common sense perspective. But yeah, all this culminates in Sony essentially asking the courts to deny Tencent's motion to dismiss. Sony wants to make absolutely sure that this does go to court so that they can make this case because they feel pretty confident that Tencent's infringement is pretty severe. And then in a separate article, News Outlet The Game Post highlights something else that Sony revealed in their filing to the court, where they talked about a second meeting that they had with Tencent. There was that GDC meeting where they discussed Project Z, and that fell through. The meeting took place in March of 2024, and then on April 8th of 2024, Sony sent an email rejecting the proposal of a collaboration where Sony would license the Horizon series for Tencent to make a game off of. And then on May 16, 2024, Tencent really tried to get Sony on board, saying that they would love it if they changed their minds because they'd already done a lot of work on Project Z because they were confident that Sony would allow for this collaboration, Project Z being what was supposed to be this Horizon game if Sony were to license that series to them. But that didn't end up panning out, but they just really wanted Sony to change their mind. In that email on May of 2024, they were citing their passion and the work they'd already done on Project Z and how they weren't interested in working on anything other than Horizon. But Sony just wasn't budging. But Sony did meet with Tencent again on July of 2024 to discuss a potential collaboration where they might license the Last of Us series to Tencent. But apparently during that meeting and during that presentation, Polaris Quest, or Aurora, the development studio for what is now Light of Motiram, had a slide in that presentation that featured Project Z, the potential Horizon collaboration that didn't end up panning out. And that slide, apparently, according to Olivier Courtemanche, who is the head of mobile at PlayStation Studios and who was directly in those meetings and went and met up with Tencent for potential discussions on potential collaborations, he's the one who claims here that in that slide featuring Project Z, it featured a female character with costume design resembling Horizon's mix of tribal clothing and metal armor, and a robot-animal hybrid resembling a Horizon robotic animal. Now that I've reviewed the promotional materials released for Light of Motiram, I believe that these images contained assets from the Light of Motiram game. I was confused by the slide given that we had rejected a potential Horizon collaboration and thought we're here to discuss The Last of Us among other opportunities. So we have a Sony executive who met up with Tencent, who saw Project Z slides. Project Z being that potential Horizon collaboration that Sony rejected. The slide featured images and assets that are very reminiscent of Horizon because Project Z was supposed to be initially a Horizon collaboration. So the fact that those images and assets can now be seen in Light of Motiram, which is legally distinct Horizon, if this is true, it all goes to potentially highlight that instead of letting Project Z go because the Horizon licensing didn't pan out, they decided to just keep going with the project, but name it something differently. Change the homework just enough where they can make it legally distinct from Horizon, which would be fine if they changed the project's overall aesthetic and art style and visual and audio language enough where you couldn't confuse it with Horizon, but they were so dead set on wanting to make this Project Z come to life, on making a Horizon game, but because they weren't given the permission to, they made a Horizon game of their own that unfortunately resembled Horizon too closely, and now they're finding themselves in legal trouble. Seems to be what's happened if this Sony executive is to be believed in what they directly quoted in the recent Sony filing to counter-argue against Tencent's sort of response to Sony's lawsuit. If things played out the way it's claimed here, it was Tencent basically going, fine, you don't want to give us license to the Horizon IP, we're still going to make a Horizon game, but we're just going to name it something different. And unless new information comes to light that puts Tencent in a better light, currently, I must say that Sony's case looks far more compelling than Tencent's. Though when it comes to how the legal battle will ensue and what new information will come to light and what the letter of the law says in terms of who's right, that's a whole other different matter. At the end of the day, regardless of what's morally correct, if the law, the current state of law, the current letter of the law doesn't give Sony the benefit, then Tencent may very well be able to get away with it. But on mine as an unofficial jury, currently, Sony is looking like the party that has the much better case to make. Like, Light of Motiram just rips off Horizon too heavily for it to feel like a coincidence. But I suppose only time will tell how all of this will play out. But for those who have been curious about the Sony versus Tencent legal situation, this is everything you need to know. These are the latest updates. And if more developments occur, I'll keep you further updated. In the meantime, though, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole case and situation. Do you feel like Sony is more in the right based on the information presented, or do you feel like Tencent has every right to continue with Light of Motiram without scrutiny from Sony? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.